Lily Brenner had never planned to move out of the city, much less to a quiet cul-de-sac, where the loudest sound came from lawn sprinklers ticking in synchrony and the occasional dog barking at mail carriers. For most of her adult life, she had been immersed in the clinical sterility of university laboratories, analyzing biochemical reactions, refining botanical extractions, and mentoring research students. When the university placed her on an extended administrative leave after a drawn-out conflict with a senior researcher regarding authorship on a major publication, she didn't fight it. She didn't have the strength, not after 2 years of mental attrition and bureaucratic pettiness that slowly sapped her energy and sense of purpose. So when the letter came stating that she had inherited her late uncle's suburban property in Briarwood Lane, it felt less like an opportunity and more like a strange kind of exile, something halfway between a punishment and a rescue. Her uncle's house had been sitting untouched for nearly 3 years, slowly aging in silence behind a line of yew trees and tangled hedges. It wasn't dilapidated, not exactly, but it had the look of something forgotten, a property no one had cared about enough to maintain, yet not neglected to the point of ruin. The garden, however, was a different story. Once her uncle's pride and joy, it had transformed into a jungle of wild-growing stalks, dried-up remnants of previous harvests, stubborn perennial roots, an invasive ivy wrapping its way around old wire trellises. As a child, Lily had spent a few summers visiting him and remembered being fascinated by the strange plants he kept, some medicinal, others fragrant or visually bizarre, always carefully labeled in neat handwriting. He wasn't a conventional gardener. He didn't care much for aesthetic landscaping. He treated plants like sentient projects, like experiments in coexistence. In her own way, Lily had taken after him, and standing now in the waist-high overgrowth of his garden, she felt something tugging at her, an echo of past summers, a buried sense of fascination. It took her a full month to restore even a fraction of order. She didn't hire landscapers. She worked slowly and deliberately, mapping the soil, testing acidity levels, identifying which species had self-seeded over the years and which had died out entirely. She reintroduced cultivars of chamomile, lemon verbena, and Korean mint plants useful in her field, particularly in her pharmacological projects involving natural sedatives and immune response enhancers. There was no plan to commercialize anything. She simply wanted to work again, to breathe life into something that responded directly to her care. The garden became a project, a therapy, a way of rebuilding her identity outside sterile labs and departmental politics. Most of the neighbors were indifferent, though a few made polite introductions. One elderly woman brought over a tin of butter cookies and mentioned that it was good to see someone bringing that garden back to life. Another offered to help haul away the old trellis frames, but Lily declined. She wasn't trying to socialize. She didn't want barbecues, block parties, or bridge nights. She wanted the privacy to recover in peace. That was, of course, until Karen made her first appearance. Karen was one of those women who seemed to walk with a permanent sense of authority, shoulders straight, chin slightly elevated, every movement suggesting that she had memorized the unwritten rules of suburban power dynamics and expected others to do the same. She was probably in her late 50s, but carried herself with the crisp energy of someone 20 years younger. She dressed like someone always ready for a meeting, even if it was just to take out the trash linen trousers, a collared shirt tucked in too precisely to be casual, and a clipboard that appeared more often than not. The first time Lily met her, she had been kneeling in the soil, replanting tulsi and wild bergamot, hands covered in dirt. Karen stood just outside the open gate, arms folded, eyes fixed not on Lily, but on the arrangement of pots and tools lined up along the path. "You're doing quite a bit out here," Karen said, her voice carefully neutral but with the unmistakable tone of appraisal. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Karen. I live 3 doors down." Lily stood, brushed off her hands on her jeans, and nodded. "Lily, I just moved in recently. This was my uncle's place." Karen's eyes didn't soften. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't welcoming. She was inspecting. "Ah, yes, I remember him. Bit eccentric, but very tidy. always kept to himself. She let that hang in the air as if it were both compliment and warning. We're a very cooperative neighborhood here. A real sense of shared upkeep. You'll find that things run smoothly if everyone stays on the same page. Lily, already irritated by the intrusion, only nodded and made a vague sound of acknowledgement, hoping the conversation would die. But Karen didn't move. Her gaze drifted back to the plants. Interesting selections. That one. She pointed to a grouping of celandine and pennyroyal. Isn't that toxic? You might want to be careful. We have dogs and kids in this area. I'm aware of what they are, Lily said, a little too coldly. They're not accessible from outside the fence. And they're for research, not consumption. Karen raised an eyebrow. Research? Are you with a company? No, I'm an academic. She left it at that. Karen finally gave a tight smile and stepped back. Well, we do have guidelines around what's appropriate for front and back gardens. I'm sure you received the welcome packet. If not, I can drop one off. It includes our recommendations and a list of approved plantings. Keeps things uniform and safe. Lily didn't reply. Karen left, but the seed of discomfort had been planted. Over the next few weeks, she noticed Karen walking past the fence more often, always slowing near the front gate, sometimes pausing to look in. Once, Lily found the gate ajar even though she was sure she had latched it. Another time, a set of trowels she'd left on a bench had been rearranged into a neat row, aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. And yet, she saw no one. She heard nothing. The real confirmation came later when she started noticing certain plants stripped of their upper leaves, not bitten, not wilted, but cut methodically at clean angles. It wasn't damage from weather or animals. Someone had taken them. First it was her skullcap plants, then calendula, and finally a few young echinacea stalks, all taken in full bloom. Nothing else was disturbed. Whoever it was, they knew what they wanted and how to take it quickly, without leaving footprints or obvious signs of trespassing. Lily, alarmed but unsure how to proceed, made notes of each disappearance and sketched a crude map of what had gone missing. She didn't install cameras, at least. Not yet, but she started locking the gate, double-checking the latches, keeping her tools indoors. And through it all, Karen remained outwardly cordial. She would wave from her porch if they passed in the morning, ask vague questions about how the garden was doing, mention how wonderful it was that someone with Lily's background had moved in. But something in her eyes remained alert, predatory. There was an undercurrent in every exchange, a power play dressed in smiles. What disturbed Lily the most wasn't even the theft, it was the precision, the awareness, the fact that someone wasn't just stealing her plants, but selecting them based on utility and ripeness. This wasn't random mischief. This was a pattern, a design, and it was only just beginning. The first real sign that things were escalating came not with a bang, but with a letter unmarked, tucked under the garden gate early one morning. It wasn't stamped or sealed, just folded twice, the paper creased by hand, with Lily's name scrawled across the front in shaky cursive. It felt oddly performative, as if someone wanted it to seem anonymous, but not too anonymous like a schoolyard note laced with threat but dressed in formality. Lily stood in the early morning light, robe still clinging to her shoulders, the dew soaking into her slippers, holding that note like it might burn through her fingers. She read it once, then again. It wasn't signed, but the message was unmistakably specific. It has come to our attention that your property may not be in compliance with local vegetation ordinances. Please be aware that certain plant species, particularly those with psychoactive or irritant potential, are not permitted for residential cultivation. You are advised to remove any questionable flora within 7 days to avoid formal complaints. There was no code reference, no header or official signature, no mention of which agency or group had written it. Just implication, wrapped in veiled civility. Lily, of course, immediately recognized the absurdity of it. There was no such ordinance, and none of her plants even remotely qualified as illegal or dangerous under any local or federal statute. She had documentation, scientific classification, peer-reviewed papers backing the properties of each species. But the issue wasn't legality, it was pressure. It was suggestion. Someone wanted her to feel watched, to feel uncertain, to anticipate trouble before it arrived. She didn't tell anyone. Instead, she photocopied the letter, stored it in her files, and continued with her garden work as usual, though now with a tautness in her shoulders. A growing sense that each movement was observed from some window she could not see. A week passed. Nothing happened. Then the inspector arrived. It was a Wednesday morning, just after 9 a.m., when a man in a navy windbreaker and khakis knocked on her door. He didn't wear a badge or display any credentials, but he introduced himself as someone from municipal code enforcement and claimed they had received a complaint about non-residential agricultural activity. Lily blinked at him, asked for ID. He shifted uncomfortably, mumbled something about left it in the truck, and gestured vaguely toward the street where no truck was visible. At that point, Lily's tone hardened. "You can leave," she said flatly, standing in the doorway, not budging. "Come back with proper identification and paperwork, or don't come back at all." The man lingered for a moment longer, as if expecting her to back down. When she didn't, he finally turned and walked away briskly, without looking back. Lily stepped outside and followed him at a distance, far enough to not draw attention from any watching neighbor, but close enough to make out his general direction. He didn't go to a vehicle. He walked around the corner and disappeared into the backyard of a house 3 doors down Karen's. It took everything in Lily not to march straight there, demand answers, make a scene. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she did what a rational person would do. She called the actual municipal code office, gave them the details, and asked if any inspections had been ordered for her address. They checked. There were none. No complaints filed. No activity logged under her name. The man had been a fraud. That evening she sat alone at her kitchen table, staring at the folded note again, the page now crinkled from handling. This wasn't petty anymore. It wasn't about stolen herbs or misplaced trowels. Someone was orchestrating a campaign of intimidation, and they were doing it deliberately, subtly, exploiting the mechanisms of assumed authority and neighborly trust. Lily had lived most of her life in a world of evidence, logic, controlled environments. But here she found herself up against something far murkier, a social game, a power dynamic, a war of nerves waged with half-smiles and plausible deniability. The next day, her compost bin was overturned. It wasn't when she'd weighed the lid with bricks. Inside, her fermenting plant matter had been scattered across the walkway, flies buzzing and the smell of rotting citrus and chamomile stinging the air. A trail of prints, faint but traceable, led through the mulch toward the rear gate. She didn't call the police. Not yet. But she wrote everything down. Documented, catalogued. Even as she doubted anything would come of it legally, she knew that the pattern mattered. The sequence, the escalation, it all needed to be tracked. That weekend, Lily went to the garden store in the next town over. She didn't want to risk local gossip or familiar faces. There she asked for something unusual, low-visibility perimeter sensors, not security cameras, but garden sensors meant to detect motion within designated soil beds. They were mostly used by wildlife conservationists or for tracking grazing animals. She explained that she was working on sensitive root propagation and needed to know if the soil was being disturbed at night. The clerk didn't ask questions. Installing them took most of Sunday afternoon. She embedded the small sensors beneath several of her most targeted plants, carefully aligning them to ping her phone if motion occurred between dusk and dawn. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't aggressive. But it was a line in the sand. If someone entered again, she would know exactly when. And they did. On the following Tuesday, her phone buzzed at 3:18 a.m. The ping was brief, no image, no sound, but the data showed movement in 2 beds, the echinacea and the monk's pepper. She got up, grabbed a flashlight, but by the time she got to the yard, the space was still. No one, nothing. But in the dirt, two distinct depressions remained, the soil freshly disturbed. The monk's pepper plant was gone. That morning, she filed a formal police report, not out of expectation that they would act swiftly, but to create a paper trail. A mild-mannered officer took her statement, asked a few questions, and left her with a reference number and a generic assurance that they'd keep an eye out. Karen, of course, was all smiles later that afternoon. She passed Lily at the mailbox, made small talk about the weather, asked if the lavender would be blooming soon. Lily said nothing, just nodded and went back inside. Later that week, Lily spotted a new flyer being passed around on the neighborhood board by the park one that mentioned the importance of safe planting in shared communities. It wasn't official. It didn't reference any governing body. But the tone was familiar. A mixture of cautionary and judgmental, framed as helpful guidance but laced with veiled scolding. The flyer warned about toxicity, strong odors, visual disturbances, and how such things could lower the aesthetic harmony of a neighborhood. No names, no addresses, but the implication was crystalline. Lily didn't respond. She planted more valerian, recalibrated the sensors, moved her medicinal plants to a tighter configuration closer to the house, and she began formulating a plan, not a confrontation, but a demonstration. If they wanted her to play a game, she would change the rules. If they thought she was a quiet academic too lost in her soil samples to push back, they would soon learn otherwise. This was no longer about the plants themselves. It was about the boundary between personal autonomy and community coercion. And someone who had crossed it too many times was about to find out what happened when you stole from the wrong person. In the days that followed her report to the local precinct, Lily noticed a shift in atmosphere not just in her garden, but in the way the street itself seemed to move around her presence. People didn't stop saying hello, but they said it with less warmth. Conversations in driveways trailed off when she approached. One afternoon at the small local grocer, the woman behind her in line stepped back and pretended to check her phone the moment Lily turned around. None of it was overt. None of it could be pinned down as harassment. But the isolation became unmistakable, creeping into her awareness like humidity in the bones, quiet, unshakable, always there. The motion sensors continued to report activity, more frequent now, more precise. Whoever was taking her plants had become practiced, visiting specific beds, targeting the most mature specimens, never disturbing more than a few stalks. It was surgical, purposeful. What disturbed Lily most wasn't just the theft itself, but the person's knowledge. Whoever this was, they weren't taking random cuttings or experimenting out of curiosity. They knew exactly which plants to extract at their peak potency. Her work was being harvested mid-cycle, which meant someone understood the growth patterns and pharmacological significance. This wasn't garden vandalism. It was a harvest-for-profit operation disguised as neighborhood friction. She had already ruled out animals, teenagers, and bored passers-by. Her cameras showed nothing. Her sensors gave her times but never faces. She had no proof it was Karen, only an intensifying gut certainty bolstered by Karen's increasingly odd behavior. Just days after the monk's pepper was taken, Lily found a thin glass vial, tucked neatly under the flap of her mailbox. It wasn't packaged, just resting there like an afterthought, as if someone had dropped it by mistake. Inside was a pale green cream, fragrant, oddly familiar. A sticky note was wrapped around it, scrawled in an overeager script, prototype. Feedback welcome. Lily stared at the cream for nearly a full minute, her pulse rising in her throat. She unscrewed the lid. The scent was unmistakable, valerian, lemon balm, even a trace of the rare Corydalis extract she'd been cultivating on a test basis for sleep regulation trials. No one in this neighborhood could have blended those ingredients unless they had taken them directly from her garden and knew precisely what they were for. Her suspicions were no longer suspicions. They were a hypothesis in need of testing. That evening she began preparing a trap. She wasn't interested in cameras or dramatic confrontations. That wasn't her style, and it wouldn't hold weight with local authorities who were already treating her complaints as minor neighborhood squabbles. Instead, she opted for something more discreet and defensible. She selected 5 plants non-toxic, completely harmless, but visually identical to some of the more potent species that had gone missing. She treated their leaves with a light, colorless botanical marker one that would react with oils on human skin, and after about 4 to 6 hours, develop a faint but visible bluish stain not easily washed off with soap. It wasn't permanent and it wasn't harmful. But it would be obvious. If someone handled the treated plants, the reaction would tell the story. She arranged the plants deliberately, near the outer bed but just far enough from the fence line to discourage casual touch. Then she waited. The sensor went off at 3:42 a.m. Lily didn't go outside. She didn't check the bed. She didn't chase the intruder. She simply waited until morning. When the sun finally filtered through her blinds, she stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee and looked down the street. The neighborhood looked unchanged, quiet, polished, reassuringly routine. But by mid-morning, the change arrived. Karen emerged from her house wearing a pale blue blouse and beige pants, hair pulled back, holding a folded pamphlet. She looked, as always, composed and purposeful. But on her left hand clear, as if painted, were faint blotches of blue, trailing from the tips of her fingers down the side of her palm, like bruises that hadn't fully developed. Even from a distance, Lily could make them out. Karen, of course, tried to keep the hand tucked into her side or hidden behind the pamphlet, but the blotches betrayed her. She walked to the notice board near the park, pinned the pamphlet, and turned back toward her house, careful not to make eye contact with Lily as she passed. Lily waited until Karen was inside before walking down to the board herself. The pamphlet was freshly printed, glossy, almost professional. It read Natural Wellness at Home, Skincare Blends from Nature's Backyard. Below the title were soft watercolor illustrations of leaves, vials, and smiling women. The first bullet point read, infused with locally sourced botanicals. The second, organic compounds you can trust. At the bottom, a contact email and a tagline, your skin deserves a garden. Lily tore it down and folded it slowly, pocketing the page. That afternoon, she made 3 phone calls. The first was to her lawyer friend from university who now specialized in intellectual property. She didn't request a lawsuit, not yet, but she wanted to know what it would take to establish formal ownership of the specific plant hybridizations she'd cultivated and whether theft of plant-based intellectual property could be pursued. The second was to the state's Consumer Protection Bureau, where she inquired hypothetically about the legality of selling skincare products without proper registration or ingredient disclosure. The third call was to the local regulatory office for small businesses, where she requested verification of a license for a business operating under the name Natural Wellness at Home. No such entity existed in their system. The following day, Lily visited the county records office in person. She requested a search for recent LLC filings under Karen's full name and address. Nothing. No permits. No tax ID. No home business zoning exceptions. Whatever Karen was doing, she was doing it off the books. When Lily returned home, there was a note taped to her fence, not folded, not anonymous this time. It read, if you have concerns, I suggest you address them directly like an adult. Dragging other people into personal matters is beneath someone of your intelligence. No name, no need for one. The implication was a confession in itself. The next morning, Lily awoke to find one of her planters overturned. Not stolen, just broken. The soil spilled, roots torn, a clean white ceramic dish shattered against the garden path. The message wasn't subtle. She spent 2 hours cleaning it up, then returned inside and sat down to begin her written report, compiling every incident with times, sensor records, photographs, and observations, organized in a file she titled Pattern of Targeted Interference, Brenner Residence. She printed 3 copies, one for her lawyer, one for the local precinct, and one for her personal archive. She didn't file lawsuits. She didn't post online. She didn't escalate with threats. She simply waited. Because escalation wasn't about yelling. It wasn't about camera footage or screaming matches. It was pressure, documentation, structure. Let them come. She was ready now, not with emotion, but with proof. And something told her deep in the pit of her stomach, where instincts hummed louder than fear, that Karen was about to make her boldest move yet. It wasn't the blue stains or the broken planter that truly shifted the ground beneath Lily's feet. It was what happened 3 days later, during what should have been the most uneventful part of the month. The quarterly community meeting held at the old recreation hall, just outside the neighborhood. She hadn't planned on attending, she never did, but that morning, she received an email from the local advisory group stating that discussion items relevant to residential plant regulations and community safety expectations would be included on the agenda. The timing was no coincidence. Someone wanted a platform. Lily decided she would be there, not because she expected fairness or civility, but because absence would give too much ground. The meeting was held in a narrow room with bad lighting and folding chairs that seemed to sink in at the middle. About 24 people were in attendance, most of them the usual suspects, the ones who commented on every email thread, who complained about fence paint colors and holiday decorations. Lily kept to the back, arms crossed, expression neutral. The first half of the meeting was uneventful budget reports, some chatter about storm drains. Then Karen stood up. She wore her usual armor, a beige blouse with crisp seams, navy slacks, a pearl necklace, and a clipboard tucked under one arm like a badge. Her tone was pleasant, her body language composed, but her eyes scanned the room with the practiced ease of someone who had already counted her allies and chosen her moment. "I'd like to briefly raise a concern that's been circulating among a few of us," she said, glancing toward no one in particular. "We've noticed a few changes in the neighborhood that, while perhaps well-intentioned, could pose safety or regulatory issues. Specifically, the cultivation of unfamiliar botanical species in residential zones, which may not be covered under current planting guidelines or community health advisories." A few people murmured. Someone asked what she meant. Karen smiled, tapping the clipboard. "I'm referring to plants that are known to cause skin irritation, strong allergic reactions, or in some cases, contain psychoactive compounds. I'm not pointing fingers. Of course. But these things have consequences. Our children play outside. People walk their dogs. One bad reaction could turn into a liability issue." Lily didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her name wasn't mentioned, but every head in the room slowly turned in her direction, with the same cautious curiosity people reserve for news stories about the strange neighbor who always kept to themselves. Karen hadn't accused. She'd suggested. She had masterfully executed a public warning without having to defend its validity. The real damage came not from what was said, but from what was now planted in the minds of everyone listening. But Lily had prepared for this. As the murmurs faded and the meeting moved on, she quietly stepped out of the room and opened her phone. In her files was a PDF of her certified inspection report issued by a state-licensed agronomist, clearly listing each species grown in her garden, including their Latin classifications, soil tolerances, and risk levels. Every entry was marked non-toxic, non-invasive, or approved for personal cultivation. She scrolled to the part that listed her monk's pepper and corydalus variants, both cleared for experimental research, neither remotely illegal. She took a screenshot and forwarded it to the advisory board's group email with the subject line, "In advance of further discussion, residential flora." She returned to the meeting just as it was winding down. Karen, who noticed her re-entry, looked up for only a second, then away. Her control of the room had held only while Lily stayed silent. The following day, Lily received a reply from the board thanking her for her clarification and stating that the issue would be considered resolved unless further formal complaints were submitted. She knew Karen wouldn't stop, but the immediate blow had been blunted. What she didn't expect was what came next, a handwritten letter, left on her porch, inside an envelope sealed with a pressed daisy. Let's not drag this out any further. If you care about living here in peace, maybe you should find another place to do your experiments. It's not personal. But this isn't your kind of neighborhood. There was no signature. She didn't need one. The threat had shed its pretense. This was no longer about regulations or safety. This was about power. Karen had established dominance in this place through years of subtle pressure and weaponized civility. She saw herself as an enforcer, a gatekeeper for the aesthetic and moral order of the street. Lily had disrupted that simply by existing, by refusing to shrink or be shamed, by reclaiming a garden and using it as more than a decorative buffer between sidewalk and house. But Lily wasn't just reacting anymore. She had started digging. Over the past week, she had quietly compiled more than botanical documentation. Using public records and business directories, she'd located a private listing under Karen's name and online storefront, registered only a month prior, selling small batch organic remedies, including sleep salves, anti-inflammatory balms, and even a tension-reducing tincture whose ingredients included several plant extracts available only through regulated sources. She archived the page, took screenshots, and noted each claim, each product description. She didn't go public. She wasn't interested in petty neighborhood exposure. Instead, she packaged the findings into a formal report and submitted it to the Consumer Protection Office with a request for business registration verification and product safety compliance review. She cited suspected unlicensed herbal product sales, use of unverified ingredients, and potential misuse of plant-based compounds not cleared for topical application. It was methodical, factual, completely detached from emotion. That night, her garden was quiet. No sensors triggered. No beds disturbed. The moon was high and the wind was still. But for the first time in weeks, Lily stood among her plants with something other than apprehension. She stood with resolve. She had not fought fire with fire. She had fought structure with structure, misinformation with proof, threat with legality. She had met the game not by stooping to its level, but by redefining its rules. And if Karen thought this was still her board to control, she was about to discover what it felt like to lose ground slowly, precisely, and without ever knowing which move had sealed her fate. The silence didn't last. For 3 days, the garden remained untouched. No sensors tripped, no footprints in the soil, no cryptic notes tucked into gates or mailbox flaps. It was, by all appearances, a return to normalcy. But Lily had spent too many years in academia, too many nights navigating the politics of institutional egos and territorial researchers, to mistake a pause for surrender. In her world, stillness often meant redirection, not resolution, and she was right. The first sign came in the form of a letter, an actual, formal envelope this time, with the return address of the neighborhood council office stamped on the upper left corner. Inside was a printed notice. A formal complaint has been filed regarding the unauthorized use of residential property for semi-commercial botanical activity, as per local zoning standards. Residents must ensure that all plant cultivation remains within personal use parameters and does not constitute an implied business venture. A failure to comply within 10 business days may result in administrative review and potential citation. It was signed by a name she recognized, one of the quieter council members who rarely spoke during meetings, someone she hadn't even realized was connected to Karen socially. Now it was obvious. Lily didn't panic. She printed out copies of her property deed, her zoning confirmation documents, and the original advisory email stating that her garden, kept based on the quantity and arrangement of beds, did not violate any current residential guidelines. She mailed them back with a calm, formal letter of clarification. But the complaint wasn't meant to succeed. It was meant to exhaust, to chip away at her sense of stability and increase the administrative weight on her shoulders. It was another play in the game. Karen had perfected pressure via paper trail, feigned concern disguised as civic responsibility. 2 days later, a man appeared at her gate, wearing khaki pants and a generic polo shirt with an ID badge clipped to the collar. He said he was with the Regional Horticulture Oversight Commission and had received an anonymous tip that certain restricted plants were being cultivated without registration. Lily asked for identification. He produced it. She took a photo. She asked if he had a warrant or inspection order. He hesitated, then offered a loosely worded explanation about spot checks and public interest. Lily didn't let him in. She stated, clearly and without anger, that any further inquiries should go through her attorney and that trespassing, even in the performance of claim duty, would be reported. The man left, but not before glancing toward the garden beds and making a small, almost amused note in his pocketbook. That evening, Lily called her lawyer again and submitted a formal complaint about harassment disguised as compliance inspections. She also updated her growing incident file, now nearly 30 pages long, and sent a copy to the state board that handled citizen complaints against coordinated neighborhood interference. Whether they acted on it or not, she didn't know. What mattered was the record. The story being built piece by piece, not in bursts of outrage but in the measured accumulation of fact. Then the real blow came. The following Saturday, Lily returned home from a short grocery run to find her gate wide open and 2 of her herb beds ripped apart. Not stolen, destroyed. The soil had been overturned, plants uprooted and flung into the gravel path, some broken, others simply buried under a pile of mulch and cracked clay. Her valerian patch, a season's worth of careful tending, was mangled beyond recognition. Whoever had done it hadn't just trespassed, they had deliberately targeted the core of her research, knowing exactly which beds mattered most. This wasn't random vandalism. This was surgical sabotage. Lily stood in silence for several minutes, her breath shallow, her mind both blank and racing. Then she went inside and called the police, not the local precinct this time, but the non-emergency line for property crimes. She filed a full report, attached the previous complaint reference numbers, and demanded an officer come inspect the damage in person. To her surprise, they did. The officer, a woman in her early 40s with the tired eyes of someone who had seen every shade of suburban drama, walked through the garden with Lily, making notes, taking photos. She asked pointed questions not just about the plants, but about the history of neighborhood tension, the prior attempts at entry, the fake inspections. Lily answered carefully, methodically. She didn't accuse, she presented. The officer didn't say much, but her demeanor shifted gradually from detached to concerned. Before leaving, she told Lily to call immediately if anything else happened, and she would personally follow up once the report had been processed. That night, Lily didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table surrounded by diagrams, receipts, email chains, her phone set to vibrate, her eyes fixed on the motion sensor app. She wasn't afraid. She was focused. Something had broken open, not in her, but in the illusion of civility that Karen had cultivated so meticulously. Whatever front she had maintained was unraveling. The shift from covert theft to open destruction marked a transition, from manipulation to desperation. The next day, things escalated again, this time in public. Lily received an email from a small but vocal local blog that covered neighborhood features, community events, and resident highlights. The editor had received a press release, claiming that Lily had been developing unauthorized herbal substances in a residential area and had refused inspection multiple times. The editor, to their credit, had decided not to publish it without verification but was reaching out for comment. The email included the document. It was unsigned but styled professionally, citing fabricated zoning codes and referencing supposed concerns from multiple residents. It also included photographs taken from a distance of Lily in her garden, of her carrying trays of seedlings, of her sorting cuttings on her porch. None incriminating, but all violating her privacy. Lily responded calmly, attaching copies of the real inspection paperwork and inviting the editor to visit the property to see the garden for themselves. She then sent the fake press release to her lawyer and filed a separate report with the state's Department of Information Integrity, a lesser-known division that tracked coordinated disinformation campaigns at the community level. Again, she didn't expect immediate action. What mattered was the paper trail. What she did next, however, was more direct. Using the license plate photo she had taken of the earlier horticultural inspector, and she filed a request for vehicle identification through her attorney's private investigation contact. The car was registered to a shell company, no surprise, but the address on file led to a warehouse space rented under Karen's husband's name. The pieces fell into place. The operation, the business, the harassment. It wasn't just Karen. It was a coordinated effort between her and at least one other person close to her, likely profiting from Lily's research in some form. Still, Lily didn't confront them. Instead, she called in a favor from a former colleague at the university who now worked in a private lab specializing in product testing and consumer safety. She handed over the vial of cream she'd kept, along with residue samples from the destroyed valerian beds, and asked for a comparative breakdown. If any part of her cultivated plants had ended up in Karen's skincare products, she wanted proof. 2 days later, the lab confirmed the presence of markers unique to Lily's hybridized valerian strain, something that couldn't have occurred naturally or been sourced elsewhere without matching genetic tags. She had her evidence, but she didn't make it public. She handed it to her lawyer, who prepared a civil filing for theft of intellectual property and unauthorized use of agricultural resources. They didn't submit it yet. They waited, because the next move wasn't going to be legal. It was going to be strategic. The silence that followed wasn't the calm before resolution, it was the stillness before the break. Lily had spent the last week waiting, not out of passivity, but calculation. With the lab-confirmed genetic match in her hands and the civil claim quietly prepared, she had one thing left to do before the game ended: give Karen a chance to go too far. Not out of cruelty, but out of certainty. Because people like Karen didn't stop when they were exposed. They stopped when they buried themselves so deeply in their own certainty that they no longer saw the pit forming beneath them. That moment arrived faster than Lily expected. It began with an unassuming invitation. One of those glossy neighborhood announcements slid into every mailbox in the area. Natural wellness at home, backyard demonstration and product preview, hosted by Karen Daniels, Saturday at 2 p.m. It was printed with elegant serif fonts and decorated with watercolors of lavender, eucalyptus, and lemon balm. Lily stared at it for a long time. It wasn't just audacity, it was a final statement of power, a declaration made on front lawns and under canopies. Karen wasn't hiding anymore. She was marketing. Lily didn't RSVP. She didn't plan to attend as a guest. She contacted her attorney, provided the invitation, and confirmed the address. The public nature of the event meant observation was entirely legal. Her attorney reached out to a representative from the local Consumer Protection Office who had taken mild interest in the case, and together they arranged for an informal visit, one that wouldn't cause a scene, just a presence. Quiet, watchful. Enough to observe, enough to witness. Saturday arrived humid and overcast, the kind of day where weather made people restless. By early afternoon, a collection of neighbors and curious passersby had gathered in Karen's backyard, where folding chairs were arranged in semicircles and tables bore neatly arranged jars and vials with handwritten tags. Karen stood at the front, smiling warmly, wearing a pale green blouse that matched the color of the product line's labels. Her speech was practiced, full of buzzwords: sustainability, wellness, mindfulness, balance. She passed around samples. People sniffed, dabbed, asked questions. And then, without warning, the representative from the Consumer Protection Office stepped forward. He wasn't in uniform. Just a clipboard ID badge and a calm voice. He didn't interrupt. He waited for a pause, introduced himself politely, and requested a copy of the ingredient list for the displayed products. Karen, unprepared, blinked once and hesitated. Then she smiled, that familiar tight-lipped expression of someone calculating too quickly and missing a step. She said the list was being finalized. The representative nodded, asked if the products had been submitted for allergen testing or safety certification. Karen replied vaguely about small batch exemptions and informal sourcing. Lily, watching from the sidewalk behind the hedgerow, didn't move. She didn't need to. Everything was happening exactly as she'd anticipated. Then the moment tipped. A guest, one of the newer residents, a woman Lily didn't know, asked innocently whether the calming cream she'd just sampled contained valerian. Karen said yes. The woman smiled and asked whether the valerian was organic or lab-processed. Karen replied with pride, "It's from a local hybrid cultivated nearby. Very exclusive." The words were soft, casual, and damning. The representative made a note on his clipboard, then gently asked for the source of the hybrid. Karen blinked. "A supplier," she said. "Someone private." The representative asked for a name. Karen's smile faltered. That was when Lily stepped through the hedgerow, holding nothing but her phone. She didn't say anything. She didn't confront. She simply stood in the open, letting the visual of her presence do the work. Karen looked up, caught her eye, and for the first time the confident veneer cracked. The moment was microscopic in duration, but massive in impact. The representative turned toward Lily, then back to Karen, and asked again, "Are you the cultivator of the hybrid valerian used in your product?" Karen stammered, something about community gardens and shared resources, but the story was already broken. There was no community garden. There was no shared cultivation. There was a single yard behind a fence with motion sensors, documentation, genetic markers, and every step of the theft archived and prepared for review. The representative thanked Karen for her time and said that a follow-up inquiry would be issued in writing. The crowd didn't boo. There was no outrage. But the shift in energy was unmistakable. Neighbors quietly placed jars back on tables. The questions stopped. The sipping of infused teas ended. The polite departure began. Karen didn't look at Lily again. She turned to the table and began rearranging labels, pretending it wasn't unraveling. But it was. Lily left without speaking to anyone. She returned home, locked her gate, and sat in her garden, surrounded by the few surviving plants from the destruction 2 weeks earlier. They were bruised, some stunted but alive. And so was she, steadied not by vengeance, but by clarity. The next morning, a formal cease and desist letter was delivered to Karen's address, followed by a registered request for immediate cessation of all product sales and distribution pending investigation. Her website went offline. Flyers disappeared. Within days, whispers circulated that her husband had stepped away from the operation entirely, distancing himself from the liability. Karen never apologized. She never admitted guilt. But she stopped showing up at council meetings. Her name faded from agendas, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the neighborhood realigned. Lily didn't take over. She didn't campaign or seek leadership. But neighbors began waving again. One left a note thanking her for handling things with grace. Another asked if she offered advice on herbal gardens. She said yes. Not because she wanted recognition, but because, for the first time, her garden was hers again. And no one was reaching through the fence. It wasn't triumph Lily felt in the weeks that followed. It was something quieter, something harder to name. Not relief, not pride, not even satisfaction. It was a kind of grounded stillness, the steady recalibration of life after a long, slow siege. The garden no longer felt like a contested space. The soil didn't hum with tension. When she stepped outside in the mornings, coffee warming her hands, the air felt like it belonged to her again. The wind passed cleanly through the rosemary and lavender beds. The valerian was growing back in cautious stalks, and the monk's pepper had rooted in a new spot she'd chosen specifically for its resilience. She walked the rows not as someone defending territory, but as someone returning to it. Karen didn't move away, but she might as well have. Her presence faded, her routines dulled. The occasional sightings retrieving mail, walking briskly to her car came with none of the energy she once wielded like a blade. The porch lights no longer burned late into the night, and the clipboard was never seen again. Whether shame, caution, or simple retreat kept her silent, Lily didn't speculate. She didn't need to. The damage had done its own work. The silence around Karen now came not from strategy but consequence. In the weeks after the incident, Lily received 2 official letters. One confirming that the product line under Karen's name had been barred from distribution pending compliance review, and another from the Consumer Protection Bureau thanking her for providing detailed, factual documentation that had greatly assisted in the preliminary investigation. The lawsuit was never filed. It didn't need to be. The threat of it had already dismantled the infrastructure of Karen's operation, and anything more would have been a pursuit of punishment, not justice. Lily had no interest in punishment. Her garden was whole again. That was enough. What changed more than anything, though, was the way the neighborhood began to reorient itself around the quiet recalibration of Lily's presence. People began stopping by not to gossip, not to pry, but to ask. A retired man from the other end of the street brought over a cutting of mint that had overgrown his yard and asked if it might be compatible with lemon verbena. A single mother with 2 small children asked if her daughter could interview Lily for a school project on plant medicine. Even the council chair, a reserved woman who'd once seconded Karen's motion to review vegetation guidelines, sent a handwritten note requesting a consult on building a small pollinator patch behind the community center. Lily said yes to each of them. Not out of obligation, not even as an act of healing, but because it felt natural. In helping others cultivate, she found herself regaining something she hadn't realized she'd lost: a sense of forward motion, of agency that wasn't defensive but generative. She didn't advertise her expertise, didn't hang a sign, didn't post anything online. But word spread. Slowly, organically. The woman with the garden full of strange plants wasn't strange anymore. She was informed, capable, precise. The neighborhood no longer looked at her garden with suspicion. They looked at it with curiosity and perhaps a quiet kind of admiration. The council revised its planting guidelines, now offering a broader section on experimental cultivation for personal use, largely modeled after the documentation Lily had initially submitted. They cited her indirectly, referencing a local case that clarified the need for botanical clarity in zoning interpretations. It was subtle, but Lily understood what it meant. Change had taken root not through confrontation, but through consistent, rational, undeniable presence. One afternoon, while pruning her skullcap row, she looked up to find a small ceramic pot placed just inside the gate-neutral beige no-card, but filled with soil and a single sprouting shoot. She didn't touch it at first. She circled it, studied it. After a while, she crouched beside it and gently brushed the soil back with a gloved hand. It was a common peace lily cutting, young and still fragile. A gesture. Maybe an apology. Maybe not. But it stayed. In the end, no headlines had been written, no public declarations made. But something had undeniably shifted. What began as an invasion of boundaries, of identity, of intellectual effort, ended not in spectacle but in reclamation. Lily had defended her work, her space, and her autonomy without shouting, without spectacle, and without playing the game the way it was designed to trap her. She hadn't exposed Karen with cameras or confrontation. She had exposed her by holding the line patiently, steadily, until Karen stepped into the open and did it herself. And now, when Lily stepped into her garden, she did so not to protect it, but to grow it.